Well, we started a series 2 weeks ago called Money Matters, and we took a week off last week just with the weather. Wasn't sure what it was going to look like, but we're going to be back into that series today. Several of us here at Trinity, we ran in a 5K this morning, and it was a great race. It was the MLK Unity 5K, and a good group of people came from North County to run this run. And when you run a 5K, you never know what the crowd's going to be like. You don't know how you're going to fit into the group. And sometimes you show up and there's a guy pushing a stroller in really, really short shorts that beats everybody. And that guy exists and he beats everybody. And or sometimes you show up and you look around and you're like, oh, this is pretty much just average people. And so that was one of those days this morning. And so I get there and I think, okay, I'm going to have a pretty good run, I think. And I haven't ran a lot, but I feel good. And so I take off kind of in the front of the group. And there's this little girl who takes off really, really fast. And when I say a little girl, she was 11. And she takes off, and I think, oh, she's going to stop eventually. She's going to wear out. But this little girl just got littler and littler as we ran because she got farther and farther away. And what I felt like I was going to be able to do was quickly diminished by this little 11-year-old girl as she won this race, beat everyone else in the race, an 11-year-old girl. And in the midst of that, I became very aware of a few things. One, I was not in near as good of shape as I thought I was. And you really can't judge people, right? You can't judge what's going to happen by size, by a female. And I didn't mind girl power. I have an 11-year-old daughter. But looking at her, I thought, oh, I'm going to do okay. And I became very aware of some stuff. And in becoming aware of those things, I had to look at myself and just literally just my shape and what I've been doing with myself and my body. And so awareness often puts things into reality, right? Our awareness. Sometimes we don't know things exist. Sometimes we don't realize how things are, but we become then aware and we have a choice, right? When you become aware of a problem, when you become aware of a need, you have a choice. We can ignore it. We can embrace it. We can learn from it. And so in this series, as we're talking about money, my goal is that we become very aware how much money matters. How much money matters. And becoming aware of that, it does something to our reality. That we won't ignore it, that we'll embrace it, that we'll learn from it, and then hopefully our lives are changed because of it. Let me say this, as some of you, maybe this is your first week with us in this series. I talked about this 2 weeks ago. You'll hear me say it for the next 2 weeks. This is what this series is not. So this is not about guilt and shame. At some point, some of you have probably sat in a place like this and you've heard someone like me stand up and begin to talk about money. And they used guilt and shame. And I'm sorry for that. That's happened at some point for you. That's not my goal in this. My other goal is not to somehow get you to give Trinity, the church, a bunch of money. It's not to get you to then decide, okay, well, I guess I should start giving money to the church. Honestly, that's not what this is about. There's not going to be a card where everyone commits to how much they're going to give and that's not going to happen. Ultimately, what I'm after and what I think Jesus was always after was your heart. I think he's always after our heart. And so because Jesus always talked about money, and I say always because he talks about money more than he talks about a lot of other things, a lot of things that we elevate and we talk about a lot, Jesus talked more about money than most of the other things that we often talk about. And so the reason I think he talked about it is because money mattered. And it mattered because of what it did to people's hearts. And so last week we looked at this idea from Ecclesiastes. This guy named Solomon was writing. They say he was one of the wisest, wealthiest people to ever live. And he kind of gets to this point in his life where he's realized everything he's done is kind of meaningless. And he makes this statement that better one handful with tranquility or rest or peace than two handfuls with toil and a chasing after the wind. It's better to just have one handful and find rest and peace than to have a whole bunch of stuff. And having a whole bunch of stuff, we experience turmoil, destruction, and pain, and stress, right? It's better to just have one. And let me say this, as you think about that, my one handful might look different than yours. Right? So it's not an amount, right? My two handfuls might only be one handful for you. But as we wrestle through this, as we wrestle through the idea, and hopefully you caught this a little bit last week, is what does it take for you to get to the two handfuls? What sacrifices, what relationships are hurt for you to get to the two handfuls? Because as Solomon said, it's not worth it because it comes with toil and a chasing after the wind. And so it's better one handful with with rest. And so this week, we're going to look at this idea, okay, so if it's one handful, well, what do I do with the excess? What do I do with my extra? Because this is what I believe. How you handle your money matters because it shows what you value. How you handle your money matters because it shows what you value, what you treasure, what you see as important. And so we're going to look at what we kind of looked at last week. So this honestly is kind of one sermon spread out over 4 weeks. So everything's hopefully going to connect. And I think we learned better that way. And so last week it was this idea that more isn't always better. And this week we're going to look at the idea of how we handle our money. We're going to look at a scripture that Jesus interacts with this group of people. It's found in Luke 12. I quickly touched on it last week. We're going to look at it more in depth this week. So Luke 12. If you don't own a Bible, there should be a red hardback Bible around you. That's our gift to you. Please take that. We want you to have access to a Bible. This week, as I read through this, I'm going to stop often and teach as we go along. So Luke 12, verse 13. It says, somebody in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Now, just before this, Jesus gives this very important teaching. Like he kind of spills everything that's important, and it's one of those, I imagine when he's done, he kind of takes this deep breath, like, okay, I've been needing to say that, I'm communicating, and this is what's important. And then he has these two guys come to him and say, "Hey, tell my brother to give me what's mine." And I did youth ministry for a long time, and there were often times where I would speak to a junior high group or a high school group, and I'd pour myself out, and they would come up and say something like, "Hey, that was great. Do you have any gum?" Right? And so you're wanting so much more, and they ask such a simple question sometimes, not all the time. But and so for this moment for Jesus, he just kind of spilled his guts, and then they come up wanting to know about him breaking up their inheritance and telling them what the other one should do. See, I think there's something really deep going on here. Because Jesus talked about experiencing life and what that looks like. But then I think what's happening for these people is they've lost someone probably that they cared for and they loved. That's why they have an inheritance. There's a pain, there's a sorrow, there's a loss. And so I think for them, they think, if I could just get my money, if I could just get my stuff, then that's going to fill in the gaps. It's going to fix the problems that I'm having. And so the fear sets in that he's not going to get what he needs. He's not going to get what he needs. And so he comes to Jesus and says, hey, maybe he'll listen to you. Tell him to give me half of what is mine. And see, the money, I believe, is lying to this man. The idea of what money will do is lying to him. And I think that's what it does to us. Our money lies to us, and it makes us believe it can do way more than it can actually do. See, it can bring satisfaction temporarily, but I think money can also bring suffering. And so verse 15, then he said to him, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So beware, be on the lookout, be safe, be careful against this greed. This idea, this selfish desire for even more. And he says, look, your life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions. Your life is not based on what you have. But it's also not on what you don't have. Right? So there's all kinds of levels of wealth in this place, and your wealth does not determine your worth, although culture often says it does. Right? We elevate the wealthy. We elevate those people who are powerful, who have a lot. I can remember as a kid growing up in Oklahoma, no one had basements. So when I moved here and everyone had basements, that was the coolest thing to me. But in Oklahoma, no one had basements, but I had one friend who was an extremely wealthy kid, and they had a basement. And it was the biggest deal to be able to go to his house and go down into the basement. And I know this makes no sense to any of you because basements are just normal. But at that moment, it was like he was the wealthy kid. Everyone wanted to go his house just so you could hang out in the basement. And so friendship was based on what he had. Right? And so our culture does this. We live in a country that elevates those who have a lot, and then it forgets about those who don't. I don't know if you've heard this, but New Life Evangelical Center, really one of our only homeless shelters in St. Louis, is being forced to close their doors. I don't know if you've heard this. About 200 people usually sleep there at night, and they're being forced to lock their doors and to close them. Do you know why? Like, they might say that it's because they have some permit issues and they need to do some things on the building, which they probably do. But I don't know if you've known what's happening in the city, but the wealthy are moving back into the city. There's these beautiful condos and these lofts. And so what's happening is the wealthy are moving in and they're saying, we don't want those people. And they're getting their way. So we live in a culture, in an environment, in a world that says, oh, you have money? Well, then your worth is in that. And we treat people certain ways. I'm not going to spend too much time, but if you want to, you could go and read in James 2. It's James Jesus' half-brother. And he begins to talk about this idea and how you're not supposed to show favoritism. And he uses the analogy of someone who comes in really well-dressed and he's got money, and the people basically say, oh, you come sit here. You come sit on the front row. You're important. And he says someone else comes in and they're not dressed that way. They're dressed like someone who's maybe homeless, who doesn't have wealth, and you put them in the back and you say, oh, you sit here. And James says, look, this shouldn't happen. We don't treat people differently by what they have or what they don't have, but we understand that is how our culture and our world works. And so part of following Jesus is living countercultural. I know not all of you are here would say you're a Jesus follower, but if you're a follower of Jesus, then we often have to go against what is the cultural norm, or what culture says is okay. So we celebrate and we worship the wealthy and the powerful. Well, it's very clear in the scriptures that God speaks up and cares for and defends the poor and the powerless. Right? And so in this moment, Jesus is saying, look, be very careful. When you begin to see greed step into your heart and your life, be very careful. Your life is not about the abundance of what you have. And so I get the picture that he's talking to this guy, maybe his brother, and he's addressing them. And then all of a sudden he turns his attention to the crowd, because there was always a crowd that's following Jesus. And so he's going to tell a parable. And usually what happens when he tells a parable is he wants the crowd to put themselves into the story. Right? So it's going to be a made-up story that Jesus is going to tell, and he's hoping the hearers find themselves somewhere in the story. And so my hope is that we all do that as well. This morning, verse 16, it says, he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Right? This guy has probably had good crops for years because he has barns, and so he's storing his good crops in barns, and now he's got not just extra, but he's got extra. And now he's got this really hard decision. What do I do with all my extra? Where am I to put it? Who am I supposed to give it to? What should I do with it? I mean, poor guy, right? It's this wrestle of what do we do with our extra? And so I wonder if some of the crowd kind of envy sets in and they think, wow, I wish I had extra. And I wish I had extra and what I would do with it. And so what is this guy's solution? Well, before we get to that, what is your solution? Right? What do you do with your extra? And I know some of you in this place today would say, look, I don't really have extra. Like you might be thinking, how am I going to pay the bills this week or this month? And so for you, you may think, I don't have much extra. And so I understand that. And if you need help, I hope that you would share that with someone. That the church, the community, we want to help each other and carry that burden for one another, to bear one another's burdens. But here's my guess. For most of us, we have some extra. We have our basic needs, and once they're met, what do we do with the leftover? I mean, it's the Netflix subscription, it's the phones that we have with the data. And I'm not saying those things are bad, but many of us think we don't have extra, but what we're saying is, I don't have any extra after I've done everything else. Yeah. Right? And so what are you doing? How do you store? Where do you put your extra? Verse 18. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. So he's going to pull everything out of his barns. He's going to sort it. He may take an inventory, tear down barns, and build bigger barns to store his excess, to store his extra. And you may be thinking, I don't have barns, and so I don't have to worry about this. This doesn't apply to me, but you have something. Whether it's a closet or an attic or a basement. Some people have storage units. Some of us pay for another place to store our extra. Right? We have extra, and so he's thinking, okay, well, I got to find a place to put it. And so he thinks, well, I'll just build bigger barns. Verse 19. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, he worked hard, didn't he? He earned it. I mean, he was blessed as a farmer, right? He had a good crop, and God's given him that. But he did it. He earned it, and so he's probably thinking, well, it's mine. It's mine, and I'll do with it what I want. See, if this is where the story was to end, we could say, look, he was just a good steward of what he had. Right? I could end right now, and we could talk about being faithful to saving, about being faithful for the future. Right? I mean, that's not unwise to know what's going to come down the road. That's being a good steward of what you have. And so we could stop right there. But we see a very hard turn, verse 20. But God said to him, you fool. Like, I don't know if you've ever been called a fool. It probably doesn't feel very good. I don't want to be called a fool. I definitely don't want Jesus to call me a fool. And so the crowd would probably be pressed in at this point, just waiting for what Jesus is going to say. They thought it was going one way, and now he's called out this guy in this story and calls him a fool. Well, why? It says, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. Tonight, it ends. Everything you've worked for, everything you've accomplished, everything you've put in those barns, every breath you have taken, it ends tonight. And money can't save you. Like, that's the thing about death, is it doesn't judge. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of money or if you have a little bit of money. It happens to everyone, and no one knows when that'll happen. And so he says, look, you've got all this stuff, and you've stored it all these in barns, and guess what? It all ends tonight. Your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Then what happens? What happens with your extra that you've been storing for years? What's going to happen to that? Who's going to get all of your stuff, the stuff that you worked hard for? Where's it going to go? See, this is the one big mistake he makes, and I think it's a mistake that we make as well. And it's this idea that everything he has is for himself. He thinks that everything he has is for himself. This little saying has stuck to me just this week as I've wrestled through stuff and was writing. It's this. It is a horrible assumption that everything we have is for our own consumption. It's horrible to assume that just because it's yours, that it really is just for you. There's all kinds of things that come alongside with that. And I think this is what he's pointing out for this man. He's saying, what's going to happen with everything that you have? This week, as I was reading about inheritance and wealth, I came across a couple of stories. And it was about these extremely wealthy people who pass away and have these huge inheritance that they leave to their pets. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but here's this woman. This little Maltese was left $12 million. His name is Trouble. And trouble set in afterwards because they're starting to receive threats of kidnapping and murder, right? So this extremely wealthy woman who probably worked really hard for it, stored it up. Her life was demanded of her. And all she could do was leave it to this little dog, or this next dog, Gunther the Fourth. They say it has an estimated value of $370 million. Right? And for us, we're like, oh, that's so dumb. Like, that just doesn't even make sense, right? What are you doing with yours? Like, it might not be at that scale. You might not have that much. But when you reach the end of your life and everything you've accumulated, what's going to happen to it? It's horrible to assume that everything you have and everything I have is for our own consumption. Now, look, this is a fair thought. I understand why we think this way. I battle against it too. I get it. You've worked hard. You get that paycheck. Of course, you want to do with it what you want to do. Verse 21. Jesus says, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So he now then looks to the crowd and says, okay, the parable's over. But the same is going to be true for you. The same is going to be true for me, that at some point my life is going to be demanded of me, and what's going to happen with my extra? Now, it's not that you shouldn't have some extra. Please hear me. But on a day-to-day basis in your yearly finances, what do you do with your extra? Have we bought into the idea that my wealth will do something for me? That if I had two handfuls, that I wouldn't have the stress, I wouldn't have the worry, I wouldn't have the broken relationships. It would fix all the problems that I have. We often believe into that lie, and so we're worried. We're worried about being generous. We're worried about giving things away because what if we need it? And so this idea about being rich towards God was kind of a new idea. There was an idea that you could bribe God. No matter what God you had, you would bribe him for something. But this teaching is very different what Jesus is saying here. Jesus isn't saying, look, you should give stuff away and you should be generous towards God, because if you are, then you'll appease God and then he'll forgive you or he'll bless you. That's not what he's saying. Being rich towards God here, and what my understanding is an idea about being rich to one another. That the way that we're rich towards God is the way that we're rich towards our neighbor. Again, the way you handle your money matters because it says what you value. I remember when Kennedy, my daughter who's 11, when she was young, we had some youth group girls that would take her out. And when they took her out, they didn't hold back at all. So they'd go eat at a restaurant and they didn't make her order off the kids' menu. They let her order whatever she wanted. And then they'd have dessert and they'd go to the movie and they would get a tub of popcorn, right? More's not always better, but they would always get the tub of popcorn and candy, and they would just pour it on Kennedy. And Kennedy would come home just feeling loved by these girls, but in the midst of all of that, in this weird kind of way, I felt loved by these girls myself. Just because they were taking care of my daughter, and they were caring for her and loving for her and just spending time with her. Like, that made me feel loved. And so my thought is, what does it look like for us to love one another with our extra? Well, what does it look like for us not to just store, but to give and to be generous people? He goes on a little later, verse 33, 34, and he says this. Sometimes we hear Jesus say things and we want to say, I think he was meaning something else. But I don't know about this one, verse 33. He says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Right? So invest in things that really matter, I think, is what Jesus is saying here. You can buy a bunch of stuff, but that stuff's going to get lost or broken or taken, so it's really not going to matter. So what if you invested in something different? And then verse 34 says this, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So as we think about our extra, we have to wrestle with the idea, okay, well, what am I going to do with my extra? I mean, what would it look like to downsize? Or what would it look like to get rid of or to give away, to be generous, to use our wealth to invest in others, to do for someone else what they're not able in that moment to do for themselves? What would that look like? And for many of us, I think that we want to live that kind of life. But then there's this tug. I experience it myself. If I give them that, what if I need that? If I give that away, what if I'm going to need it next week? I haven't used it in 5 years, but next week might be the week that I'm going to go and need that. What if I give it away? What's going to happen? And so I understand these fears, these worries, the ideas of how we handle our extra. But I also hear Jesus say, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think one of the number one contenders for your heart and my heart is our stuff. It's our wealth. It's money. Money isn't bad in and of itself. Please hear me say that. It's the love of money, right? It's not that money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. And so oftentimes what we treasure, see, it's not the other way around. It's not where my heart is, then treasure comes alongside. It's whatever I treasure, there my heart will go. So if I treasure stuff, if I treasure notoriety, if I treasure those things, well, then my heart begins to go to those places. But if I treasure people over possessions, if I treasure what God's called me to more than my own security and satisfaction, my heart begins to go to those places and begins to go to those people. Now, this is what's really interesting about the story. The farmer is not called a fool because he has a lot. Notice this. He's not called a fool because he had a great crop and a great harvest. So making money wasn't the issue. Having a good harvest was not the issue. What was the issue? What he did with it. The issue, and what I said earlier, is how he handles his stuff, his money. And so please hear me. I'm not saying you can't buy for yourself. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't go buy a new outfit or whatever. I'm not saying, maybe you don't need to, but every time you spend money, I'm not putting guilt on you, okay? Just how do you handle your excess? What do you do with your extra? John Wesley, who is kind of a founder of our faith and our theology in the Nazarene world, he's quoted as saying, gain all you can. So make as much as you can, right? To understand what that looks like. To save all that you can. To be wise, to be good stewards. And then he says to give as much as you can. To gain it, to save it, and to give it. And I think the give is the place we have to pay attention to. And so super, super quick here. A couple things as we close up. 3 things I hope you'll do. One is you have to understand that God is greater than your riches. Like really believe that. To really believe that what you're longing for will never be solved by your stuff, by your money. It's a chasing after the wind. You'll never catch it. But what you really are longing for is acceptance and love and grace, forgiveness, and that comes through God. When you experience that and you hold on to that, you're able to then begin to let go of some of your other things. Number 2, and I've said this a couple times, that it's people over possessions. We have to put people over possessions. I've seen so many marriages, I've seen so many relationships that struggle because of work, because of this idea of needing more. I'm just going to be honest, and you can pray for Heather and I. We're just trying to figure out even where we're at in life. And Heather and her job and what she might want to do. And so as we're talking about this, we're like, okay, if you change jobs, if you do something different, that might mean that we downsize. And that's okay because we want to choose each other. We want to choose family. We want to choose our community over making sure that we have extra. Right? And so this isn't something I'm just laying on you and say, you need to figure this out. Like this is our life. This is what we wrestle with as well. We want to be generous people. We want to lead the way with radical generosity. I'm not asking you to do anything that we're not trying to do either. And some of that comes when we're able to put people over possessions. And so how I handle money matters because it says what I value or who I value. Not just what, but who. And then the last thing is what if we just begin to use our extra, and many of you do this, to be generous. Here's my big challenge for you is to plan your generosity. Plan your generosity. Sometimes we'll never get around to being generous if we don't plan it. Maybe you'll respond here or there to a need and you'll give money or you'll buy something and that's always great. But I think ultimately what happens is if we'll plan to be generous, then we realize what we're putting into place and we say, okay, well, I value that, so I'm going to make a plan to value that. And so here's where it starts to get a little sticky and you're like, okay, I know what you're about to ask. I knew we were going to get to this point and you're going to begin to say, well, you need to give to Trinity. And I'm not. Many of you do. We set a budget every year based on what we think our community is going to give, and we're right around that number. So you don't have to give here. I mean, you're invited to. You're invited to be a part of what we're doing, but God's going to continue to use us whether you do or not. But let me say this. Pick a percentage, and if you feel like, man, I just don't know if I can give it to the church, I'm lucky just to be back in the church, and there's this barrier there, I would rather remove that barrier for now, right? And you just be here, and you pick somewhere else to give money to. Right? This Unity run we did today, I just became aware of this great nonprofit here in North County called the Youth Alliance. The Youth Alliance. So if you're like, look, I'm not gonna give to the church. I don't really know how I feel about that yet. Give to them. Find someone to be generous to. If you have a neighbor in need, be generous, but plan it. And the way we plan it is a percentage. Right? So maybe you just want to look at your finances and you want to do a budget if you're married and you want to say, look, okay, I think we'll give this percentage away this year. Maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 13%, whatever it is. With your extra above your need, what percentage could you give away? Because what happens is your heart begins to follow that. And in all my years, especially once I got married to my beautiful wife, who this was a part of her life when we met, it was not a part of mine. And so I had to grow in this area of being generous and to give to the church. But every year when I've given and I get my letter back of saying how much I've given, I've never looked at that number and regretted it. I've never looked at it and thought, oh man, what could we have done if I'd have just kept that? I haven't missed it. But I look back a month ago and I regret buying something. You won't regret being generous. You won't regret being generous. And it's not just about generosity, but as we've said, it's about your heart. Jesus is after your heart. He's after the heart of the people who are listening to this story and saying, you fool, everything you have is going to be gone when you die. What then? What will you do with it? Would you pray with me? And then after we pray, we're going to end with communion this morning, and so I'll walk us through that after I pray. God, thanks for this morning. Thanks for an opportunity to be in your presence. God, this is one I'm wrestling with myself, and want to be faithful to you, God, in my extra. I want my heart to follow what I treasure, and so, Lord, I know what you've told me, and that's people. It's you. It's my neighbors. And so, God, would you help us to love our neighbors well and to show people what we value by how we spend our money? God, we need your help in this. There will be this pull, I know, Lord. There's going to be this pull to think that we're not able to be generous. God, I pray that you'd encourage us this morning, even as we walk out of this building, to figure out what it looks like for each one of us to live a life of generosity, to understand that how we spend our money matters, and it's an opportunity to honor you. God, would you help us? I pray in Jesus' name, amen.